In the middle of the Neolithic period, Europe was thriving. Farming had spread from the Near East to the Atlantic. Villages were growing. Trade networks stretched hundreds of kilometers, and people built wooden temples. They raised children and buried their dead with care. Then it all stopped. Between 5,000 and 3,000 years ago, something broke. Populations crashed. Giant settlements were burned and never rebuilt. Entire cities, pottery styles, burial traditions, and language groups vanished from the archaeological record. For decades, nobody had any idea why. There were theories involving war, migration, and climate, but none of them fully fit the events. None of them fully fit the scale or the speed. Something was off. Civilizations do not just abandon their homes for no reason, not across a whole continent, and not all at once. The answer came from a grave in Sweden, then another in Latvia, and then dozens more. It was found not in the bones themselves, but in their teeth, deep in the pulp, where blood once flowed. Scientists extracted something microscopic, something old DNA from Yersinia pestis, the plague. This strain, however, was 3,000 years older than the Black Death. Its discovery was not the end of the story. It might have just been the prologue. When scientists reconstructed the genome of a 5,000-year-old bacterium from a girl buried near the Volga River, they were not expecting to find the earliest known strain of Yersinia pestis. That is what it was. She was not an isolated case. Dozens of other Neolithic and Bronze Age individuals buried from the Baltic to the Caucasus tested positive for ancient plague DNA. The genetic sequences show early, non-flea-borne strains of Yersinia pestis moving fast across vast distances. This happened centuries before the classical pandemics of written history. The question then became, how did it move so fast? This strain was not hosted by fleas or rats, so the obvious candidates were the Yamnaya people. Around 3000 BC, these steppe herders exploded outward from the Pontic-Caspian region. Within a few centuries, their descendants, the corded ware and bell beaker cultures, had replaced most Neolithic populations across Europe. Linguistically, genetically, and even architecturally, the steppe left its mark. Yersinia pestis seems to follow the same path. One theory, supported by genetic overlap, argues that the Yamnaya already carried the plague as they expanded. They did not invent it, but they helped deliver it. The steppe migrations may have acted like a fuse, connecting distant populations. These populations had not evolved a resistance to the plague. This opened new transmission routes and triggered outbreaks in communities with no immunity. There is another possibility that has been debated, that the plague came first. The earliest confirmed Yersinia pestis strains, like the one from Samara, appeared just before or during the initial Yamnaya expansions. The timing aligns with the abrupt collapse of Neolithic settlements in Central and Eastern Europe. Some archaeologists now argue that it was the plague that emptied the land. It depopulated the continent so severely that the steppe migrants did not conquer Europe. They just walked into it. In that version of the story, the plague was not their weapon, it was their opening. What is clear is that the plague did not stay local. Once mobility increased via migration, trade, or war, the pathogen moved with people. The people who moved most were from the steppe. Whether they brought the plague or merely survived it better than others, the result was the same. An old world collapsed and a new one took its place. For decades, the story of early European prehistory was told in modest terms of scattered villages, quiet farming communities, and little drama. Then, archaeologists started digging into the Ukrainian forest steppe and found something that changed the whole narrative. What they found were not villages, but actual cities. At sites like Maydetsk, Talyanki, and Nebelivka, sprawling settlements emerged. These were mega structures of the Neolithic world, built almost 6,000 years ago. Some covered over 300 hectares, housing tens of thousands of people. Medetsk alone may have held as many as 50,000, which is more than the population of Uruk at its peak. It was nearly the size of ancient Athens. There were no roads, no wheeled transport, and no writing systems. Somehow these people built and maintained dense urban centers with intricate circular layouts. They had house rows, central temples, and planned perimeters. They constructed homes from clay and wood, raised livestock, cultivated grain. They traded raw materials across hundreds of kilometers. They also burned their houses, not by accident but systematically. Archaeological layers show that houses were intentionally torched every 60 to 80 years. They were then rebuilt in place. Some interpret this as ritual renewal, others as sanitation, or both. Either way, the practice created layer upon layer of ash and debris, preserved like a time capsule. Inside those layers, something darker waited. There were no toilets in these cities, no drainage systems, and no waste removal. Domestic animals lived close to humans. Grain silos attracted rodents. Those rodents carried fleas. Everything needed for an epidemic was present: population density, poor hygiene, high mobility, and no immunity. In the clay floors of these mega settlements, archaeologists began finding mass graves. These graves had multiple bisa. They contained multiple individuals laid together and no clear signs of trauma. Then came the DNA testing, which revealed that some of those individuals carried Yersinia pestis. These cities had become incubators. The early form of the plague, lacking the flea-borne adaptation, could still spread through direct contact, droplets, or contaminated food. When thousands of people shared space, water, and air, the pathogen did not need advanced biology to move. It just needed hosts and sufficient population density. Evidence from sites like Vertiba Cave in western Ukraine suggests that the communities began to decline rapidly after their peak. Homes were abandoned, settlement density plummeted. Unlike in Mesopotamia or Egypt, there was no transition to the next urban phase. The mega settlements were not replaced, they vanished. Time and the limited durability of the building materials did the rest. What rose later were smaller, more fortified communities built by different people. They had different gods, different tools, and in many cases, different DNA. The Neolithic cities were not conquered by armies, they were dismantled by microbes. In a quiet field on the island of Giland in southern Sweden, archaeologists uncovered what looked like a typical Neolithic burial. It was a stone tomb sealed for millennia, filled with the remains of several dozen people. This was not a peaceful family resting in death, it was a mass grave. 38 individuals, all related by blood, including men, women, children, and grandparents, were not stacked haphazardly, but placed with care. They were placed generation after generation. At first, there were no clear signs of violence, no arrowheads, and no crushed skulls. The violence was elsewhere. DNA told the story. Researchers extracted microbial material from the teeth and bones and found unmistakable evidence of Yersinia pestis. It was present in 32% of the individuals. It was not from a single outbreak, but from 3 genetically distinct waves. These waves were spaced out over more than a century. Imagine the feeling of recurring horror these people experienced, seeing this disease return years after year. The first wave infected and killed members of the family. The survivors rebuilt and buried their dead. Then the plague returned as a different strain, but the same pathogen, killing another wave of the family. A third, more virulent and widespread wave followed, possibly airborne. This final strain carried mutations in the bacterial genome linked to a respiratory form of plague, what we now call pneumonic. It is the most contagious version and the deadliest, as it does not rely on fleas but moves through droplets, breath, and close contact. In a tight-knit farming community, it would have been unstoppable. The archaeological layers support the genomic evidence. Between each plague wave, the tomb was resealed and then opened again. Each time new bodies were placed with the old, and each time fewer people returned. The family did not just end. It was pruned slowly and repeatedly until no branches remained. It is rare to catch a pathogen evolving in real time, and even rarer to watch it devastate a single lineage over generations. But in this tomb, that is exactly what happened. The grave on their land became a record of one family's extinction, written not in language but in blood, bone, and bacteria. Across Eurasia, the Neolithic world was collapsing. Between the forest zones of Scandinavia and the river plains of Central Europe, archaeologists have found signs of abrupt cultural disappearance. Longhouse villages were abandoned, ceramics that had endured for centuries stopped being made. Burial practices once rich with symbolism were replaced by hurried or missing graves. This was not a slow decline, it was sudden, widespread, and seemingly synchronized. In regions once dominated by large, organized farming communities, population density dropped by as much as 50% in a matter of centuries. Genetic data shows a sharp reduction in diversity, and skeletons from the period begin to show more signs of trauma, malnutrition, and stress. The funnel beaker culture of Germany, Denmark, and Poland buried their dead in stone tombs that still dot the European landscape today. Then, almost overnight, the megaliths went quiet, their pottery disappeared, and their settlements were replaced. One of the first large-scale farming societies in northern Europe vanished around 2800 BCE. The Cucutini, Tripilia culture, who built some of the largest Neolithic settlements ever discovered, with sites like Talianki and Medetsk spanning over 300 hectares, was gone by 3000 BCE. For a time, these were unprecedented in scale, massive and complex proto-urban communities that existed centuries before the first cities of Mesopotamia. At first, archaeologists blamed their collapse on environmental stress or internal conflict, but the timing now aligns too well with the spread of early plague strains. In some sites, like Jukim in Sweden and Rusovaki in Ukraine, entire extended families are found buried together, suggesting sudden, simultaneous death. At Latvia's Gabokon site, a young woman and infant were buried side by side. There is plenty more evidence, but still very little was written about. Why until the pathogen was found? When Yersinia pestis DNA began turning up in Neolithic remains across Europe, it reframed the story. The plague did not just kill individuals, it destabilized entire societies that were just starting to emerge. In some places, people burned their homes and did not rebuild them. In others, they buried their dead in mass without ceremony. There are sites where adults were buried without children or children without adults, suggesting whole family units were wiped out because no one was there to bury the survivors. Some settlements show signs of panic, like unfinished tools, smashed ceramics, and rapid abandonment. Others hint at violence, not from invasion but from internal collapse, as people fled infected sites or fought over dwindling resources. Social cohesion fractured. We have no written record of this transformation, no Hippocratic treatises, and no clay tablets mourning the pestilence, but we have graves, a lot of them scattered on a much larger scale. In sites across Central Asia, researchers began recovering Yersinia DNA from individuals buried during what should have been prosperous growing period. Instead, these settlements were shrinking. Entire regional cultures, like the Botai in Kazakhstan and the Afanasivo in Siberia, faded rapidly during the pathogen's expansion window. Then it jumped again, this time into China, then into the Indus Valley, and eventually into the Roman and Byzantine worlds. As trade and movements were slower at the time, so was the propagation of Yersinia pestis. Paradoxically, the bacterium also participated in slowing down these trade routes by killing plenty of individuals along the way. But that did not stop it from spreading. The next time it made history, it was ready. Being hosted by so many different living beings leads to rapidly occurring mutations, some more advantageous than others, at least for the bacteria. By the time it reemerged in the 6th century AD, it had transformed into a full-fledged industrial killer. This led to what was unfairly called the Plague of Justinian. It was unfair to Justinian because it is not like he invented it himself. He just reigned during the first outbreak. And what an outbreak it was, with a death toll in the tens of millions. This wave specifically killed from a third to a half of the entire European population of the time. It started in 541 and received the perfect welcome, as volcanic eruptions and war were already wreaking havoc across Europe. You can hardly imagine how tough things were at that specific time. 4 years prior, the year 537 has been designated by many researchers, especially medieval historian Michael McCormick, as the worst year to be alive in human history, not 1349 when the Black Death ravaged Europe, and not even 1918. When the First World War and the Spanish flu literally amputated European societies of tens of millions of young and healthy adults. The combination of everything that happened by 506 and before, up until 541, when the plague of Justinian struck, dealt a blow so hard that society only started recovering from 640 nearly a century later. I mean just started, because the end of the plague of Justinian was dated to 767, so there was plenty more death in between. How do we even know all this? How do we pull a forgotten pandemic out of prehistoric graves and reconstruct its entire evolutionary arc? How did Yersinia pestis evolve that way? It is not in any written record. It has been deduced from the gaps, the mass graves, the lack of traumatic injury, the burned settlements, and so on, as well as in the DNA of the dead and the few survivors. Yersinia pestis was not always as we have known it from the books. Sure, it seems like it was always deadly no matter when we encountered it. But there are key differences between strains over time. The early ones lacked one thing, the YMT gene, essential for flea-borne transmission. The genes it did possess, though, included the PLA plasminogen activator, which enables the bacteria to invade the lungs, break down tissue barriers, and move quickly through the bloodstream. It is associated with pneumonic and septicemic plague, the most direct, aggressive, and contagious forms, and they were almost always fatal. But the issue for a disease, as you will notice right away, if you have ever played a game of Plague Inc., is that you cannot spread if you kill all the infected too fast for them to infect other people. That is exactly what happened back then. In the absence of modern medicine, the three main forms of plague, bubonic, septicemic, and pneumonic, had average mortality rates reaching 93%. Septicemic plague could kill in a day, often before symptoms fully appeared. Pneumonic plague, transmitted through droplets, could sweep through households in hours. Even bubonic plague, the slowest of the three, still killed the majority of those infected. Without antibiotics, there was no recovery, only isolation or burial. It was a disease that altered the trajectory of entire populations, and by 800 years ago, that is exactly what it did. Yersinia had acquired the EMT gene necessary for flea and rat gut survival, so it had evolved from a limited human to human pathogen. It could only thrive in settlements once it scattered the population. The spread was cut off. But now, with the YMT gene allowing the bacteria to survive in fleas and rat guts, even if the settlements were deserted, burned, and sanitized, the rodents and fleas would keep on following the survivors or find new food sources in nearby settlements. This new Yersinia pestis 2.0 also came with a full arsenal of immune, dodging adaptations, delayed detection, and increased infection rates. When the Bronze Age arrived, it was already killing with industrial efficiency. With the development of major trade networks that emerged across Eurasia, the pathogen was now perfectly tuned for transit. It could travel by carta licet. It could travel by camel or ship. It could live in warehouses under floorboards or in a flea cocoon waiting for warmth. When it struck in the 6th century and again in the 14th, and again the 19th, it did not come out of nowhere. It was just an upgraded version of that Neolithic killer. What did we really lose during these events? Before the collapse, Neolithic Europe looked nothing like the world that followed. At sites like Madetsk and Talyanki in modern-day Ukraine, homes were built in concentric rings, remarkably uniform in size and layout. There were no palaces and no elite residences, just rows of identical dwellings carefully arranged across vast landscapes. On the scale of mega settlements, you would think there should be at least a few homes that were bigger, but not here. These were rivaling early Mesopotamian cities in size, yet without defensive walls or militarized boundaries. At the center of many settlements stood monumental wooden structures interpreted as communal temples, spaces likely used for ritual rather than control. The society that built them appears to have been organized around cooperation, not domination. Burial practices matched this pattern. In cultures like Funnelbeaka and Tripilia, graves typically lacked rich differentiation. While some individuals were buried with beads, tools, or ceramics, the offerings were modest and widely distributed. There is little evidence for social stratification or inherited status. Power, if it existed, was not encoded in wealth or warfare. These were communal worlds, held together by shared ritual and symbolic order. Then, something shifted. In the centuries that followed the Neolithic decline, new cultures emerged across Europe, the corded ware, the bell beaker, and the early Bronze Age in Metis. Their settlements were smaller and often fortified. Their economies were increasingly specialized, and their dead were no longer buried as equals. Graves now told a different story. A few individuals, mostly male but not limited to them, were laid to rest with prestige items like bronze daggers, drinking horns, amber beads, and gold ornaments. Others were buried with nothing at all. The contrast is sharp and unmistakable as social inequality had arrived, and it extended into death. Ancient DNA makes this even clearer. In Central and Western Europe, the genetic landscape changed rapidly. Populations with Neolithic ancestry were largely replaced by groups carrying genetic markers from the Pontic, Caspian steppe. In some regions, as much as 3/4 of the local gene pool was overridden. The transition was demographic, not just cultural. More telling still was what happened to the Y chromosome. While maternal genetic diversity remained relatively stable, male lineages narrowed dramatically. A small number of patrolines began dominating entire regions, suggesting a shift toward rigid patrilineal inheritance. This was not a migration of families. It was a restructuring of power. I did a more detailed video on the topic. Feel free to go check it out by clicking on the top right. At the same time, the landscape itself changed. Defensive architecture began to appear for the first time in millennia. Settlements were now surrounded by ditches, ramparts, or palisades. Territory mattered, and control of resources became central. Technological change accelerated. Bronze replaced stone, and with metallurgy came new hierarchies, access to copper, tin, and the knowledge to fuse them into weapons and tools created new classes of power. Trade routes expanded, but they flowed through the hands of those who controlled the metals. In the background, myths shifted too. As Indo-European languages spread, so did their symbolic worlds, pantheons of sky gods, warrior heroes, and patriarchs. These stories emphasized lineage, conquest, and divine right, values that echoed the new social order rising in their wake. None of this happened overnight. It unfolded over generations. The change is visible in everything from house plans to burial goods, from fortifications to genetic lineages. A communal, egalitarian world, one that was ritual-rich, artistically vibrant, and structurally flat, was replaced by one that prioritized hierarchy, defense, inheritance, and control. The shift laid the foundations of the world to come. Property, patriarchy, political boundaries, and inequalities all have roots in the aftermath of that ancient transition. The societies that rose from the silence did not just survive the collapse. They redefined what civilization would mean. More than civilizational change, this left a deeper mark within each and every one of us. We often think of ancient pandemics as isolated catastrophes, events that came, killed, and left no trace but trauma. In reality, it is quite the opposite. Pandemics, as you might have learned from our collective experience with COVID-19, always leave antibodies within the survivors' organisms. The same goes for Yersinia pestis. Genetic studies across Eurasian populations show signs of intense natural selection around genes associated with immune response. In particular, alleles involved in macrophage activation, inflammatory control, and pathogen recognition show dramatic frequency changes after the Neolithic period. These shifts are not subtle. They point to a species-wide immunological reshaping. Natural selection had turned the plague into a pressure test. Those who survived were not just the isolated ones who took back the land later. Most of them had a greater immune response to face the infection. One study of European genomes found that certain variants of the ERP2 gene, part of the system that processes foreign proteins for immune presentation, rose in frequency after the Black Death. The pattern may have started much earlier, perhaps with this first plague, and throughout history. The phenomenon was greatly emphasized as humans regrouped, built cities, and contracted more and more diseases that spread to an ever larger number of people. Another study found that ancient strains of Yersinia pestis likely exerted pressure on the toll-like receptor pathways, key components of early pathogen defense. This implies the impact of this bacterium was much more important than first thought. Entire populations may have been sculpted genetically by exposure to this bacterium. Survivors then passed on the tales and stories of those who did not make it, and the aftermath of the whole tragedy, along with whole new immunological baselines. There is a second kind of echo demographic. Ancient DNA has revealed that several Eurasian populations went through pronounced bottlenecks after the Neolithic collapse. Genetic diversity plummeted, particularly in male lineages. Some regions lost almost all traces of the pre-collapse Y chromosome diversity, replaced almost entirely by a few dominant lineages associated with post-steppe migrations. It was not just a plague, it was a filter, whether the plague was the cause or not. It at least facilitated the transition from existing populations to the Yamnaya, who arrived after. Most likely, Yersinia pestis arrived before or at the same time as the newcomers from the steppes. It led to a great drop in already settled populations, both male and female. The Yamnaya then exterminated or enslaved the few men left and integrated the women and children that survived. Entire languages, traditions, and family lines disappeared alongside immune profiles, cultural practices, and symbolic systems that no longer had bearers. This is why some researchers describe Yersinia pestis not simply as a pathogen, but as a silent architect of history, a hidden force that redrew the genetic and cultural map of a continent. It is impressive to see how much this single bacterium has changed our history at so many points in time. It did so back in the Neolithic, it did during Justinian's reign, and it did during the Black Death events. This last one was dramatic and brutal, but especially well documented. Its deep foundations may have been laid millennia earlier, during a quieter apocalypse we are only now beginning to detect. That is the silence we are carrying with us every day, in the genes we inherit, in the diversity we have lost, and in the traits we did not know were forged under pressure. Yersinia pestis has left its mark not just as history but as biology. Perhaps the craziest part is that we did not know it until just recently. The oldest pandemic we have ever faced did not even leave us any stories, only genomes. For thousands of years there were no chronicles or legends, just archaeological sites, abandoned cities, sealed tombs, and microscopic traces in teeth. Only now, with ancient DNA and global genomic datasets, are we beginning to understand how deeply the microscopic, especially Yersinia pestis, shaped human history through death and through the aftermath as well. It ended lives, lots of them, but it also redrew maps, led to the collapse of cultures, and in its wake, helped build the foundation of the world we live in today. If this story reframed how you think about pandemics or made you look at human history a little differently, consider supporting the channel. Leave a comment what part of this forgotten plague surprised you the most. Was it the family buried 3 times, the cities without walls, or the population replacement? Like the video if it helped connect dots you did not know were connected. Share it with someone who still thinks the Black Death was the worst plague ever. And subscribe if you want more stories that live between extinction and emergence. This channel exists because of your curiosity, your clicks, your questions, and your time. Thanks for being part of it. Until next time, keep listening to the echoes.